we could call this time together a therapeutic meeting for our children. A therapeutic meeting, because that word therapeutic from the Greek means an attendant. So we're attending to the children. We are their attendant. And in these words, we're speaking of a very special mood of soul, and can ask ourselves, with what gesture do we meet the children? A great responsibility and a great opportunity. How can I perceive the children in my care new every day? So this responsibility of being an attendant, Rita Steiner characterized it this way. You can find your way to that perception, those kinds of perceptions, if you set out to do so with the love that I have spoken to you about. We all come to earth, and this thought really comes from Henning Kohler, who I think is sort of a man of our time. He wrote 2 books. One is called Difficult Children, and the subtitle is There Is No Such Thing. And then the second book is called Working with Nervous, Anxious, and Depressed Children, which is kind of an unfortunate title because it's an incredible book for parents and teachers. But Henning Kohler talked about the children, and how we all of us come with the same gesture, and that gesture is looking for the way. We all come looking for the way. And one of the reasons I have the picture of Madonna Sistina here is that if you look closely at it, if you can see the original, which unfortunately I went to Rome thinking I was going to be able to see it, but it's in Dresden. It's not in Rome, it's not in the Vatican. But it's kind of hard to see because of the glare, but in a really good, in the good painting, this is actually a good print, you can see there are hundreds of little faces in the periphery around the Madonna. It's called the Madonna Sistina. It was in the Sistine Chapel. And to demonstrate how important that it's in private Waldorf schools, kindergarten. Every Waldorf school, kindergarten has a picture of that hanging on the wall. And the reason for that is demonstrated by the story of an autistic little boy who never spoke, didn't speak ever, but every day he came in and stood there and looked at that. It's as though he was able to find that match for himself of what he came to find in his incarnation, in his birth, coming to find that which speaks to him the same way as those little faces of the unborn children coming to be born. It's like finding the match. It's the guest looking for the way. And in that kind of gesture, he finds comfort. In Henning Kohler's book, Difficult Children, There Is No Such Thing, he calls these children coming and trying to find their way and coming to us every day with trust and with kind of self-assurance. He calls that the act of self-entrustment, which makes us ask, are they finding in us and in what they have presented to them through Waldorf education or through us as individuals, are they finding what they're looking for? They come with this new hope every day. We know that at night, the child goes into the spiritual world as we do, and they come. That's it. At night, all all grievances with children are melted away, and they come again in this incredible act of self-entrustment. And again, we ask, are we giving them what they are looking for? So in 1924, Rudolf Steiner came to a group of people, a group of students, and gave him what's called the Curative Course. And it's now translated into, the title is, I thought I had it, but I don't, Children in Need of Special Care. And that's the original, the green one, the Curative Course in 1924. And it's, for me, it's my Bible. I do Waldorf remedial therapy with children, and it's my Bible. And it's a Bible for many, many Waldorf teachers. Because we get there indications of how we meet the child every day. It's a guide for any imbalances that we see in the children. We find it an indispensable guide, even though that was written in 1924, it's as relevant in 2022 as it was in 1924. It's like a beacon of hope. And it was out of his work with children that he saw ways in which we can meet the child with any difficulties. And so through a series of stories about autobiographies of people, of biographies of persons that I feel related to or sort of have a resonance with, I'd like to share with you what he brought. One of the things he brings, Rudolf Steiner, in the Curative Course are 7 virtues. And so I'd like to bring those to you, these 7 virtues of the Curative Course, and sort of tell you about them and then give you a story that relates to each one of those. So at the end of the 20th century, which has often been glorified as the century of the child, a crisis mood was really permeating the country about questions for education and upbringing. And it was at that time that many of the disorders of childhood, with which I work actually, were being classified. And now we have at least 70 titles, 70 definitions of the difficulties that children have. And Henning Kohler says, can children actually be spoken of increasingly as difficult? Or is it not that the overall status of consciousness today and of the society, the circumstances of society, that we're drifting towards a situation that is unbearable for children? That's difficult. That's why children are called difficult. It's not they're difficult. We are difficult. Just who or what is difficult anyway? And if we look at the fundamental gesture of parenting and teaching, what comes to us, what comes to mind, I think, is that the child has come to us as an apprentice. The child has come to us to learn how to be in the world. They don't know, but they come as an apprentice to learn how to be. And again, they're looking for the match. I always use this term, they're looking for the match of what they experienced in the spiritual world. Beauty, truth, wisdom, that's what they're looking for when they come. And do we give that to them? That's what they're looking for. They come as this apprentice looking for these things. And are they meeting that when they come? A guest looking for the way. We as attendants. So we see the child as coming to us to help uncover and explore the gifts that they have brought. In other words, saying almost that the child has brought news from the spiritual world. And how do we discover that? And I believe that through Rudolf Steiner and these 7 virtues, as well as reading Henning Kohler's Difficult Children, There Is No Such Thing. So the first virtue is, and I've asked Rebecca if she would write these down. The first virtue is called inner courage, or actually Steiner calls it esoteric courage. And I could say that what that means to me, and these virtues are sort of sprinkled throughout the book, what that means to me is that we need to enter the child's situation as though it were our own. And by this mirroring back and forth, we receive help in knowing what to do. We have sort of united ourselves with the child, and we're becoming selfless enough to reflect it back so that the child can experience, this person sees me, which is a gift, and it doesn't happen as often as it should. And we can use that thought that we have to be selfless enough to be able to see what the child is bringing and reflect it back. And Rudolf Steiner says, use this thought as a meditation or a prayer every day. It'll be a while till the next one comes. Oh, thank you. It's going to be a while. This changing ourselves in order to assist the children. So when we speak about courage, esoteric courage, we talk about inner courage. And I want to tell you a story, a personal story. For some reason, I have a real affinity to reading stories about the Holocaust and the concentration camps. And there's a story it's called The Hiding Place. And it's a story about, do you know the story? Corrie ten Boom and her sister, I forget her sister's name, but they hid Jews all during the Holocaust, all during the Nazi concentration or occupation in Poland. And eventually, of course, were found out and taken to the ghetto, Poland ghetto, Warsaw ghetto. And Corrie and her sister, they saw her parents be killed by the guards. And at one point, Corrie and her sister were watching the guards beating up a woman to death. And her sister said, "Oh, poor woman, poor woman." And Corrie said, "Yes, I think she's going to die." And her sister looked at her and said, "No, I say poor woman about the guard." And that is the kind of courage, esoteric courage, it takes to recognize what is really happening, that the guard is the one who needs to be blessed, as well as the woman who is dying. And an addendum to that story is that when I was a teenager, my parents brought her, and she lived a long time. She got out of the ghetto. Her sister was used as medical, by Mengele. But anyway, Corrie came to the United States, and my parents brought her to our home. And I remember as a teenager, can you imagine for a teenager, hearing these stories and watching this magnificent woman? It's what builds sort of an inner soul quality to see this kind of personality who was able to go through such difficulties with courage and come out with such joy. So Corrie ten Boom and the story of The Hiding Place. And her sister said to her, "No hate, Corrie, no hate," as she was seeing this woman being beaten to death. The next story is one of Janusz Korczak. And I tell you that, it's over there, he is someone that I think probably knew Rudolf Steiner and probably learned from Rudolf Steiner. And he was not a Jew. He was a professor, a history professor and a doctor. And he dedicated his life, when the Nazi occupation came to Poland, he dedicated his life to running an orphanage for children, bless you, and many Jewish children. And the stories of how he raised those children as Rudolf Steiner would have wanted. And when he was arrested by the Nazis, he prepared the children. The children were all dressed beautifully. He dressed them up and told them they were going to be going on an adventure. Well, for 2 years they lived in the ghetto, the Warsaw Ghetto, and he cared for them as if they were his own children. And eventually, they were, of course, put on the trains to go to Auschwitz. And there was a woman from the theater who knew him, and because he was not a Jew, he could have been saved. He could have saved his life. And she was trying to get to him and say, "We'll save you, come with us." And he said, "You never leave children at a time like this." So he went with those children on the train and walked with them into the gas chambers. So again, this picture of esoteric courage, of putting oneself in the place of the child. Janusz Korczak. He felt that within each child is this moral spark that could vanish the darkness at the core of human nature. That's Rudolf Steiner talking about the children. So, esoteric courage. The next one is devotion to detail. We need to be as interested, this is Rudolf Steiner speaking, we need to be as interested in the child's one strand of hair as we are in the sun and the moon. And he's talking about this devotion to every aspect of the child. To the way their fingernails grow, to the way they walk, their ears, the way their chin is situated. I have it with me, but it's not out. Unfortunately, what I've done is take photographs of the children's ears. And you would be amazed at the difference. Nobody's ears are the same at all. And when you do that, you see the difference. You may not know what it means, but what it does is it creates a link to them. It creates a link to their being. The ears are so reflective of your inner life. And there's this amazing book called Reading the Face. Do you see it here? One more. Here, Reading the Face. And in here you might look at it. This is an anthroposophical doctor who lived in England, and he has taken every aspect of the human being, the ears, the nose, the mouth, especially the head, the face, the chin, the hairline, every one of those, and how it reveals the individuality of the person. And so we look at the child in interest, and those things begin to stand out, and we ask ourselves, what is it that takes your interest when you are looking at a child? And sometimes that's the doorway in. Like, what does it mean when a child is burping and, playing with the air and being really obnoxious, or farting actually, to get attention, whatever? They're playing with the air. What does that mean? You might not know what it means, but it might be the doorway in. And as someone who works with remedial therapy, these are the things we look for as I see a child coming toward me. What is it that catches my eye? Is it the way they walk? Is it the way they move? What is it? Are they one-sided? What is it? And this is attention to detail, devotion to detail. Every aspect of the child is part of the mystery of who they are. And it's this quality of interest in the very thing that sometimes repels us or annoys us about a child who picks their nose and eats it, or any of those things. I mean, I had a child that actually, he was really a child that I struggled with so much, and he had a lot of challenges. And one day he was jumping rope, which he couldn't get the rope over his head. He was 10 years old, and so I was trying to get him into his body and jumping. And while he's jumping, little rolls of poop were falling out of his clothes onto the carpet. I have a carpet, right? So what is my response? Of course, I was kind of horrified, and then I thought, what is this? I know, it was shocking. And yet, what was that? Well, on examination, I found out this child, and I didn't know this, had what's called encopresis, which is a releasing of feces, and they don't know it. They can't smell it. It's actually a medical terminology. But I didn't know that. So if I didn't have interest in it, if I didn't have devotion to detail, I would not have known that this child is suffering from encopresis. In other words, part of his senses are shut off. So this interest, this devotion to detail, everything about a child reveals something to us. And again, I may be able to find those pictures. You'll love the pictures of the ears. And then there's also the picture, the gaze of a child. I have a folder of gazes of children, maybe 20 different children, and their gaze reveals something about them. And what is that? You might not know, but you create a bridge of interest. So this devotion to detail through interest. The third virtue is, I can do it. I can do it with the help of the spiritual world. And in my experience, and this child I just mentioned is one of those, that I have to say those words over and over to myself every day, almost like a meditation, not just feeling them, but saying them over and over and discovering how far we have to go in that direction to really meet that I can do it with the help of the spiritual world. It's like a courageous consciousness. If we've had a difficult day, repeating it over and over, I can do it. And coming back the next day, remembering that every tug in the right direction is strengthening and confirming. Henning Kohler calls this an evocative attitude of the educator calling forth from the child. I can do it with the help of the spiritual world. I have so many stories I could share with you, and I always have to choose which one is the best. But we know that when we have a problem, when we have a difficulty, the first thing we must think about is, how can I use the night? How can I use the night? How can I take this question into sleep and hold it for the child's angel, or for our friend's angel, or for our angel? But it's more for I'm asking the child's angel for help. And what I believe is that often when we get these answers, which we do, is that it's from the child himself and the spiritual world at night speaking to us. But taking these questions into the night and asking for help, please help me figure out I can do it with your help. And I'll just tell you a really brief story. It's called, what's the name of that book? I think it's called Butterfly Swimmer, or it's one of those amazing stories today. One of the things that will help you a lot as a teacher, I believe, is to read Steiner, is to read education, Waldorf education, but also biographies, autobiographies of people, which I spend a great deal of time doing. And there's a book called, I think it's called Butterfly, and it's the story of these two sisters who were in Syria, and of course the bombing there and the destruction of Syria, they had to leave. They had to leave by themselves. They were Olympic swimmers, and they were, teenagers, and they had to leave, and they had to travel God knows how far to get to the Mediterranean, where they would cross over into Italy. And they got, if you know the stories of these immigrants who make these horrible, horrible crossings, they got in a boat that was way overloaded, and people were ready to not make it. And a storm came up, and one of the girls, they were both terrified of the ocean. They weren't terrified of water, but of the ocean. So one of them got out. She was a Olympic swimmer doing the breaststroke. So she holds onto the boat. And her sister came out, but she couldn't do it. She was too weak. But the girl holds onto the boat, and she swims the breaststroke all the way to Italy. And she kept saying to herself, I can do it. I can do it with God's help. So it's this ability to bring forth the reserves of the courage that we have with the help of the spiritual world. In my own life, I could tell you countless stories at my age of the kinds of experience where there are difficulties and I need that help. And I get it. I get the help when I ask. It's sort of like when you take that into the spiritual world at night. Maybe the next day or 2 days later or 3 weeks later, you wake up and there's a gift under your pillow of the answer to what you're looking for. Again, I can do it. Because we encounter in sleep the angel, the child's guardian angel. And if we make enough provisions for it, we will get the answer. And I think it's the child, actually, as I said, who gives us the answer in the night. This question of I can do it. As teachers, we have these children who are most difficult to manage in the classroom. And of course, there's always reasons for that, and we may not always know. But I want to tell you the story of a child who was adopted from Russia and who was 6 years old in a kindergarten, 5, 6, and every day was a major problem for him. And he couldn't pay attention, he couldn't listen, he argued, he fought. But the teacher who had him knew these things. And she would talk to me during the day. She's actually my best friend. And she'd call me every day, and we'd talk about this boy from Russia. And she said, I don't know what to do. But we talked about taking it into the night, which she always did. One day she decided to do the story. Oh, I must have this picture. Barb, could you know that bag that has the pictures in it? Maybe you could. There's 2 pictures of the donkey.
This bag?
No, it's the bag.
I can record while you're okay.
It's the bag that has the white bag with all the pictures. Sorry, you guys. I have to show you these. Probably the trees is in there too. Thank you. So, one day, she decides to tell the story of the donkey, of the fairy tale of the donkey from the Grimm's fairy tale. Who knows that story?
I think.
Could you tell it in about lines?
Gosh, I don't know if I remember it with that much detail. The one with the donkey suit.
I can tell you real quickly.
Okay.
So the donkey is this darling little donkey, and he learns to play the lute with his hooves, which I'll talk about later. I'll talk about that actually this afternoon. But he learns to play the lute or the lyre with his hooves. So one of the pictures of that is how we need to many of the problems our children have is because they're not in their body, they're not incarnated. They need movement in order to help them come in and to realize themselves. So this picture of the hooves is one of those really important indications. But this teacher knew intuitively that this story of the donkey could be of benefit to this child. And the story of the donkey is that, I won't tell the beginning, but he goes to the he's banished from one castle, and he goes around and he finds another castle to go to, and he's drawn to it, and they allow him in. The king loves him and always brings him to the royal table, and he has, of course, a beautiful princess, and the princess falls in love with him. And so every night he sleeps in her chamber, and nobody knows it except the princess. But every night he takes his donkey suit off, and there is the prince. But in the morning he puts the donkey suit back on, and nobody knows it except, of course, the princess. So one night, it's just a beautiful story. One night the king comes in because he senses that this is happening, and he takes the donkey suit and burns it. And what that means is this beautiful young man has to become himself. So the transformation of the self through this getting rid of the outer layer of whatever it is that's holding him in. So she's telling this story, this is again early childhood, and she knew if she could help find the match for this child, it could help him. So she tells the story. The next day she said, who would like to wear the donkey suit? And this little boy from Romania, who is having the worst time in the world, puts the donkey suit on and acts out the story of the donkey, which is the transformation of the self. That comes from, I can do it. I can find the answer I need for this child. And I want to read to you, it's like this inner accompaniment that I spoke about. And I'd like to read to you, so here's the picture of the donkey, the transformation. Here's the king taking the donkey suit and burning it. And here's the picture of him playing the lute, which is to me a picture of the need for movement that is transformative. The point of all of this is that she and I wrote an article about this whole experience of the inner accompaniment, of finding the match, of this selflessness, this interest. And it was published in an anthroposophical journal. And I would like to read you, if I can, sometimes I can't get through it, crying, but this is the poem that she wrote for this child. She gave me away. I opened my mouth for her milk, but she left, and I swallowed the wound instead, that pierced through my body, and it still runs through my blood like a fire, and I have to fight to still the pain. I become a hunter at sunset, searching for my life. Have you seen it? The wild animals that live inside me hold parts of me hostage. They seek me out, and I am the hunter and the hunted. At night, I lay my skin down beside my bed, and am lifted and carried to the king. Meet me there at the gate, for this is where the wedding takes place. And you must be my forgiving guest at the feast. Always be my forgiving guest. There each night to inherit the kingdom of my life. Meet me there. conversation we never had. This is the only conversation we must always live. And I share this with you because this is an example of a teacher who could enter in with interest and devotion and courage to find what this child needed. And she was able to find that match, help him find that match for himself, for transformation. And that's what, my friends, we are called to do. And that's what Rev Steiner brings us in these virtues. I can do it with the help of the spiritual world. I will find a way. Not the result, not is it fixed, but transformation along the way. We could call that an act of rescue. And isn't that, my friends, what we are asked to do in these times is an act of rescue with every child. Because every child in our time is suffering from the results of our time, our culture, especially the past 2.5 years, when nothing is the same as it was before. These acts of rescue, and if we could see ourselves as holding that as a possibility, that this is what we are here to do with the children. And you know, it's not like you have to be Hercules. It's not like you have to be somebody great. It's like we're all who we are. We all have these possibilities of becoming transformed. We all have the possibility of performing acts of rescue for our children. So the next virtue is called esoteric striving. As I said before, in sleep, all grudges are melted away, and everything else in the way of habits and routine that have crept into our lives can disappear in the relationship with the child. And again, as I said, the child gives himself or herself to us every day, over and over. And the durability of that trust is striking. At night, the child enters this, we do too, this pure sphere of hope. And we must practice releasing the past day and practice love for the child to open the door that they bring to us. And in a sense, we are a sounding board for what the child has brought from the night. Bringing, as I said before, the latest news from the spiritual world. How do we find that? How do we see that? I think we can see this story, this picture of this esoteric striving in an amazing story of what's called the prison angel. I don't know if it's, yeah, it's right there. And I always try to sort of just tell you a few things about a story, which is hard, but this is about a woman. She was Catholic, which is an important part of her biography, and she was an actress, movie actress in Hollywood. She had 5 children, wealthy husband, wealthy life, rich, doing everything that people in Hollywood do. And she began to feel that her life had more meaning than just being an actress, being in the limelight, having her life be so easy. So she was in San Diego, and she decided to go to the Tijuana jail. Now, if you know anything about Tijuana, the jails there are the worst in the world. And she decided to go and help. And the guard said, no, you can't go in. And she said, yes, I can. I'm going to go in and meet with the prisoners and with their families. So she spent a long time, years, going there on a daily basis to minister to the prisoners. And what began to happen is that she was so loved that whenever there was a riot, they called her in to help and to be, to speak to everybody, to speak to the prisoners and the guards and calm things down. And believe it or not, she got to the point where she said, I need to, if I really want to do this work, I need to live in Tijuana prison myself. And they refused, and she said, I insist, I'm going to do it. So they gave her a cell, and it was no different than all the other cells where there was sewage running right down in a little, what do you call it, right in front of her cell. And she lived there, and it was cold and dark, and she insisted on living just how all the other inmates lived. And eventually she felt like, I want to be a nun. I want to wear a nun's habit, the outfit that they wear. So she goes to the Pope and she said, I want to wear a habit. He said, no, you can't do that. So she made one herself. And you can see it's beautiful, beautiful picture of her wearing a habit. So here's this Hollywood starlet living in the depths of Tijuana prison. This courage because she saw the need in humanity for this kindness and this love and this tenderness, which she would give the inmates foot rubs. She would get from her home all the things she could to make them comfortable. She'd bring them food. So and she spent her life there. She died there. And then finally the Pope did recognize her and said she could wear a habit. Sister Antonio is her name. And she never worried about risking her life, which she did. And there's one more story that I feel like you should know about this esoteric courage, and sort of combined with I can do it. One of the heroes for me of my work is called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, over there, and it's by a psychiatrist who was the psychiatrist who took care of the children who were rescued from, the big compound in Texas where the Mormons were holding people hostage. What was that?
Waco?
What?
Waco?
Yeah, Waco, Texas.
Okay.
So whatever was happening, the federal troops came in, and these children, and all the children were taken out, and they were horribly traumatized. So there were a lot of, maybe, 75, 100 children. And he took care of those children. And the tenderness and compassion of this man. And in this book, he has stories of children and their trauma and their difficulties and their life that was totally destroyed, not necessarily by Waco, but other circumstances. And there's one particular story about a child named Justin, and he had been raised by his uncle who didn't know any better, which you can't hardly believe, but he wasn't a bad man. He just thought the boy should be raised like a dog. And so he raised him in a dog house outside and fed him dog food, and he never had any comfort or trusting or any of the warmth that all the things a child needs. So he was finally taken over by the state. And when he was taken over, he was put in a home, and nobody could get near him because he was so traumatized and so out of control. He was about 4 in this story. And the minute anybody would get near him, he'd throw feces, he'd throw whatever he could do to just keep people away. Well, Dr. Perry was called in to see him. So he came in that first day, and he came in with his head down, not looking at the child. He took off his white jacket, and he said, oh, this is so much more comfortable without that jacket on. Didn't look at the child, didn't speak to the child. And then he took out a biscuit out of his pocket. This kid couldn't be fed because he'd throw everything. Took a biscuit out of his pocket, and he just took a bite, and he said, oh, that really tastes good. And then he just, little by little, got closer and closer and closer until he was almost to the child, and then he said, "Would you like a bite?" And the child took it. And that's the entry into the child, this courage to listen, to have interest in what this child needed. He knew intuitively. And the story of what happens to Justin is that he was transformed over time. Dr. Perry was able to transform him. So we have these wonderful examples of ways in which we can find the way in, we can find a match for a child who is struggling, who is frantic, who is terrorized. And often we know that trauma is at the base of that. He said, this is quote Dr. Perry, "One of the greatest lessons I've learned in my life is the importance of simply taking the time before doing anything else to pay attention and listen. Because of the mirroring neurobiology of our brains, one of the best ways to help someone else become calm and centered is to be calm and centered ourselves, and then just pay attention and listen." That's muscle building, esoteric courage. I can do it. Interest. The next virtue is inner intuition. And Barb, I could use that bag again, I'm sorry. The ability to perceive, which is thank you, is inherent in everything we've been talking about. The ability to see what is in front of us. Henning Kohler calls this an active sculptural understanding. And I don't know if anybody in this room has been to Rome and seen the David, sculpted by Michelangelo. But it is this unbelievable experience where you walk in the museum and it's really a long way away at the end of a hall. And I mean, the minute you walk in, I start weeping, and you walk up to it, and it's perfect. It's this huge, almost maybe 1.5 as tall as this room, and every detail of the David it's called the David. When I have a picture of it, I did have a picture. I don't have a picture. Oh, here. Every detail is perfection. And the thing that's so interesting is that Michelangelo sculpted this knowing, so he has this block and he's sculpting knowing there is something in there that needs to come out. In other words, he didn't know what it was. He found it through this inner intuition of what lived inside. He was carving away what was not the David. So, an intuition of what lives within. The Seri Indians are a group of Indians that live on the upper coast of Mexico, and I've spent quite a bit of time with them years and years ago when they were very primitive. My brother did work there, and I would go down with him often, and they did these carvings, and I meant to bring them, but they're these beautiful, I don't know if anybody has seen the ironwood carvings of the Seri Indians, but they're a nomadic tribe, and they carve them out of ironwood, and I've watched them as these old men, this was in the late 60s, I was there, these old men sit around the fire, and they just carve, and they carve away what is not the object. In other words, they say they don't know what is inside. And these beautiful carvings, they're they're birds and alligators, or doves, or rams, or animals and birds that are and fish that are on the desert, dolphins that are in the desert because they're right on the edge. So this inner sculptural understanding, this inner intuition, and we can have that when we observe the child with a lover's attention to detail. That's how David or Michelangelo carved the David. That's how the Seri Indians carve their animals. The ones you get today are not like the originals. When you see the originals, you know that they were carved out of this inner intuition. Some of that comes out of an inner intuition that refuses to draw conclusions. So if you drew a conclusion, you wouldn't be able to do that. This inner conclusion to know that something is to be revealed, but you have to find it. Trusting the inner intuition of what the child has chosen for his or her life, and how to help them find that. Because isn't that what they want? A guest looking for the way to help you find what it is they came to do. That's what our job is. A path to beginning to understand. Interest, intuition, devotion to detail. And the most important is this this genuine interest to succeed day after day when it's very difficult, but we come back every day. I can do it. Even when a child is so hard to handle, saying to yourself, this child has beautiful, enduring, admirable characteristics. I will concentrate quite consciously on those instead of on the difficulty. I want to tell you about a teacher. I want to tell you about a teacher whom I know very well, a class teacher. He took grades 3 times through, and then is now teaching special subjects in high school. One of the funniest people I've ever been. So that's one of his qualities, can make people laugh. So his students are laughing all the time. I'm laughing when I'm around him ever. And he has this ability to see into each child. And there was a 6th grade girl who, in his 2nd or 3rd, 6th grade, who was shy, who was almost captured inwardly by this angst and social anxiety and never spoke. And one day he said to her, would you meet with me for a few minutes after school? And she said, yeah. So he sat down with her and he said to her, tell me about yourself. Tell me who you are. And she talked for half an hour, and she'd never spoken in class. She went home that day and told her mother it was the best day of her life because someone had listened to her. And I was in a situation recently where it was a biography situation, I think, class or something. And we were in a group and we were supposed to pair up 2 people. I was with someone I knew really well, and he said, we were supposed to talk about when somebody was interested in us. So I'm starting out telling the stories of my life where I was really fortunate to be listened to a lot, particularly as a child. And then I said, so Jerry, what about you? And he said, nobody ever listens to me. He said, I've never been listened to. I'm the one that listens. He's a great teacher. I know him very well. Nobody listens to me. I do listening. So how do we meet the child with that kind of interest that makes them feel like this is the best day of my life? So this teacher, another teacher who tried to find out another child who has lots of difficulties, who didn't seem to be good at anything in the class, and she thought, how can I find what this child is good at? So she discovered, and this is a story from Rudolf Steiner, that the child was good at riding bicycles backwards. So she had developed a situation in the class where everybody was to bring their bikes and everybody was to ride their bicycles backwards. And of course this child was, the hero. But here we are again. Interest, enthusiasm. I can find it. I can do it. So the last virtue is enthusiasm for the truth. So the story I'd like to share with this virtue is when Rudolf Steiner had all these students around him, there were children, of course, they were working with, and he would be asking them to describe the children. And there was one particular child who had particular challenges, and he said that he wanted them to think about this child, take them into their sleep, live with this child, observe, as we've said before, interest, enthusiasm, all the things we know that need to happen in order to really meet the child and understand them. And a few days later, when they met, he said, so did anybody figure out what it was? Because here's what the mother said. He said, I want you to see if you can tell what happened to that child, or what it was that precipitated some of her problems. And he said, I spoke to her mother, and I found out what some of the difficulties were. And this one girl raises her hands and she said, I know what happened. Here's what happened. And she described the difficulties that this child had had, and it was identical to what the mother had said. And everybody was really quiet. Nobody said anything. And Steiner said, when you heard that you found the truth, you should have jumped as high as the ceiling. You should have jumped so high that you made a hole in the ceiling. In other words, you should be so enthusiastic when you learn the truth, right? But sometimes we just kind of hide ourselves, hide our enthusiasm. And I can tell you a story, my own story of myself. I had a student, this was a long time ago, and he was in 7th grade, couldn't read, and his parents were just frantic. He was a really darling kid with lots of capacities, but he couldn't read. And I was trying to figure out why he couldn't read, and take him in and sleep at night. And one day he said to me, I asked him, to talk to me about, every day he'd talk to me. And one day he said, I painted my room black. And I said, you painted your room black? He said, yeah, I got black shades, and painted it black, and I got a black cover for my bed. And I said, well, that's really interesting. Why is that? And he said, I'm just more comfortable in black. I took that into sleep, and what I discovered is that he had such difficulty with glare that any time he picked up a book, like if he picked up this to look at it, he couldn't look at it because there was a problem with his eyes, that the glare constantly gave him, he had terrible headaches, migraines. And it was the glare that created the migraines, that created the headaches, that created his inability to read. Well, I can honestly tell you I was thrilled. And I was thrilled because this child had gone through so much with his parents and the schools, saying that he was dumb. I mean, they really were terrible to him. And we always know, no kid wants to be bad. No kid wants to fail. No kid wants to have these difficulties, right? So these virtues give us a pathway into this ways of being, develop this enthusiasm. Like the same teacher I told you about, he was working with physics with the high school, and he's always doing research, and he found something at home that he'd been working on for a long time, and it worked. It was something to teach the children, and he told me personally, he said, I ran to the school. I could not wait to get there and tell the students. So there you are, enthusiasm for the truth. It's what we all have within us if we can find it. The other thing we have in this is this last virtue, enthusiasm for the truth. What brings that out is humor. Is humor and smiling. Without humor, life gets very boring. Rudolf Steiner told us every lesson the children should laugh. Every lesson the children should laugh. Most of us don't laugh enough. I can tell you that Barb and I laugh a lot, and it's great. I grew up laughing. I'm one of those fortunate people that had a situation of growing up laughing. Laughing is the elixir of life. So this humor that can join into all these virtues and lift. What happens when a child swings, right? When a child swings on a swing, right? So they get to that point up here where you're lifting out, and what do? You can watch them, they're laughing, right? What about when a child is jumping rope? Have you ever seen children jump rope where they don't laugh? Or they don't smile? It's that little lift. It's that little lift out when they jump up, and the same with going on a swing, out. And that's what humor does. It lifts us out. And it's part of what stands behind all of these virtues, is this picture of humor. So one more thing is the delicate and fine power of observation. This picture of being the sculpture of our souls, of the souls of our children, just like the sculpture of David, Seri Indian sculptures. Henning Kohler said, with new garments, he said, this is the dilemma of the modern child. With new garments, I sit in front of the mirror in solitude. And my friends, that is the dilemma of the modern child today. I sit in front of the mirror in solitude. And I believe that it is these virtues that help us find a way of lifting the child out of the mirror in solitude. And there's nowhere else that this happens to the extent it can happen in Waldorf. If we can take these indications from Rudolf Steiner, the dilemmas of our modern child can be healed and helped through these virtues. They're the guiding stars. So I hope I have left you with some thoughts that can enrich and enliven the work that you do with the children. And I'd like to read the verse again. And I think when we listen to this verse a second time, it becomes more alive after having heard some of these indications. Again, the verse by Herbert Hahn, the first Waldorf religion teacher. It will indeed come to be for us a necessity that we observe the children day by day, and also exercise in ourselves day by day control of our own thoughts and feelings. Every child has a subtle perception of whether the person looking after him or her, or teaching him or her, is inwardly equipped in their soul. The child's well-being depends to a great extent on what is growing and developing in the inner soul of the person in charge. Develop your keenness of observation, nurture the powers of your inner being, develop vitality of thinking, depth of feeling, and strength of willing.